There's a particular kind of exhaustion that comes not from working too hard or sleeping too little, but from finding yourself once again in the same painful situation with a different person. You look across the table or across a room or back through your memory, and you notice the pattern. The same emotional unavailability, the same subtle disrespect, the same feeling of giving more than you receive, the same slow erosion of your own sense of worth, and somewhere beneath the frustration, beneath the disappointment, there's a question you haven't quite allowed yourself to ask directly. Why does this keep happening to me? That question deserves a serious answer, not a comfortable one. Not a reassuring one that lets you off the hook by placing all the responsibility on the other people who have moved through your life. A real answer. One that requires you to look honestly at yourself, at your patterns, at the invisible architecture of your inner world, because that architecture is far more responsible for who you attract and what you tolerate than most people are willing to admit. Let's start with something that might feel uncomfortable immediately. The people who enter your life are not random. They are not simply bad luck, poor timing, or the unfortunate consequence of living in a world full of difficult human beings. There is a selection process happening, and you're participating in it constantly, mostly without awareness. You are broadcasting something, and the people who respond to that broadcast, who feel drawn to you, who feel comfortable with you, who feel like they fit, are responding to something real that exists within you. The question is whether you understand what that something is. Think about the way a radio tower works. It doesn't transmit every possible frequency simultaneously. It transmits a specific signal, and only receivers tuned to that frequency pick it up. You're doing something similar, not through any mystical mechanism, but through something far more concrete and far more psychologically interesting. You're transmitting your level of self-worth. You are transmitting what you believe you deserve. You're transmitting your tolerance for certain kinds of treatment. You're transmitting your unresolved wounds and your unconscious expectations. And the people who enter your life are, in many cases, perfectly calibrated to meet you exactly where you are, not where you wish you were. This is not a pleasant thing to consider, but consider it anyway. There's a concept in psychology that deserves more attention in everyday conversations. And it's the idea that we tend to recreate familiar emotional environments even when those environments are painful. This isn't stupidity, it isn't weakness, it's actually the psyche doing something. It believes is intelligent, something it has been doing since childhood. The mind learns early what relationships feel like. It learns what love feels like, what closeness feels like, what safety feels like. And those early templates become the unconscious standard against which all future relationships are measured. Here's the paradox that sits at the center of this. What feels familiar often feels right, even when it is objectively harmful, not consciously right. You won't sit down and think, this person who dismisses my feelings is exactly what I need, but something underneath conscious thought will recognize the emotional texture of the relationship and say, I know this. I know how to navigate this. This is what closeness feels like to me. And that recognition, that sense of emotional familiarity can be mistaken for connection. It can be mistaken for chemistry. It can even be mistaken for love. This is why someone who grew up with a parent who was emotionally unpredictable, sometimes warm and sometimes cold, sometimes present and sometimes absent, often finds themselves drawn to partners who operate the same way, not because they want to suffer, not because they lack intelligence or self-awareness, but because the emotional pattern is familiarity at a deep psychological level, registers as safety, even when it isn't safe at all. And this is where the real work begins, because once you understand this mechanism, you can no longer simply blame the other people. You have to ask yourself what emotional environment you were trained to navigate. What did closeness look like when you were young? What did you have to do to receive affection or approval? What behaviors did you learn to accept because accepting them was the only way to maintain a relationship with someone you needed? Those early adaptations don't disappear when you become an adult. They go underground. They become part of the operating system that runs beneath your conscious choices. And they express themselves not through deliberate decisions, but through what you find attractive, through what you find comfortable, through what you find yourself willing to tolerate before you finally say enough. Now, I want to be careful here, because there's a version of this conversation that can become another form of self-punishment. You hear that you're attracting difficult people because of your psychology, and you turn that into a weapon against yourself. You think, so it's all my fault. I'm broken. I'm the problem. And that's not what I'm saying. This isn't about fault in the way we usually think about fault. Fault implies deliberate wrongdoing. What we're talking about is something more subtle and more interesting than that. We're talking about unconscious patterns that were formed in response to circumstances you didn't choose in a developmental period when you had almost no power to do anything differently. The child who learned to walk on eggshells around an angry parent didn't choose that adaptation. They survived by developing it. But here's where responsibility enters the picture, and this is the part that most people resist. You didn't choose the patterns that were formed in you, but you are now an adult. And you have the capacity, with effort and honesty, to become aware of those patterns. And once you become aware of them, continuing to act on them unconsciously is no longer simply a product of your history. It becomes a choice you make by refusing to examine yourself, a choice you make by continuing to select comfort over growth, familiarity over health, the known pain over the unknown possibility of something better. The question isn't who hurt you. The question is what you're going to do with the person you became in response to being hurt. Let's talk about self-worth, because this is the mechanism that underlies almost everything else in this conversation. Self-worth is not self-esteem in the shallow sense that phrase has come to mean. It's not confidence in the performative sense. It's not telling yourself you're great every morning in the mirror. Self-worth, in the deeper psychological sense, is your actual felt sense of what you deserve. It's the invisible price tag you carry into every relationship. And that price tag determines with remarkable accuracy what you're willing to accept and what you're willing to walk away from. When your sense of self-worth is genuinely healthy, something interesting happens in your relationships. You naturally, almost automatically create standards, not as rules you consciously enforce, but as a kind of internal gravity. When someone treats you with disrespect, it doesn't feel right. Not because you're offended in a fragile way, but because it genuinely doesn't fit the reality you've built inside yourself. You don't have to convince yourself to leave a situation that's harming you. The discomfort of staying eventually becomes greater than the discomfort of leaving. But when self-worth is damaged, when it was formed in an environment where your needs were secondary, where love was conditional, where your value depended on your performance or your compliance or your silence, the dynamic reverses. The discomfort of leaving feels greater than the discomfort of staying, because leaving means confronting the possibility that you might not find anything better. It means confronting the fear that maybe this is what you deserve. It means stepping into the unknown, and the unknown is terrifying when you don't trust yourself to navigate it. And so you stay. Or you leave, but you find someone remarkably similar because the pattern hasn't changed. The internal price tag hasn't been revised. There's another dimension to this that rarely gets discussed, and it has to do with what we might call the need to be needed. This is different from the desire to be loved. The desire to be loved is healthy and universal. The need to be needed is something else entirely. It's a particular kind of relational strategy that develops when someone learns early that their value in a relationship depends on what they provide, on what they fix, on what they rescue, on what they sacrifice. If you grew up in a household where your emotional role was to manage someone else's feelings, to be the responsible one, to smooth over conflict, to make the difficult person feel better, to be the good child so that things didn't fall apart. You may have internalized a deeply problematic equation. I am valuable when I'm useful. I am lovable when I am needed. I belong when I'm fixing something. This equation drives people toward partners who need fixing, not consciously, not with any malicious intent, but because the person in chaos, the person with problems, the person who is emotionally unavailable or struggling or difficult, that person offers something that feels like purpose. They offer a role, and when you've built your identity around being the rescuer, the helper, the one who holds things together, a partner who doesn't need you in that way can feel strangely uncomfortable. They can feel boring. They can feel like something is missing. And so you find yourself again and again drawn to the person who is interesting precisely because they are complicated. Drawn to the person whose emotional unavailability creates a kind of chase. Drawn to the person whose problems give you something to solve. And you mistake that sense of purpose, that feeling of being needed, for genuine intimacy. Real intimacy doesn't work that way. Real intimacy isn't built on one person rescuing the other. It's built on two people who are each capable of standing on their own, choosing to stand together. The foundation of a healthy relationship isn't need in the desperate sense. It's preference. It's the genuine choice to be with someone, not because you can't function without them. Not because they need you to save them, but because their presence genuinely enriches your life and yours enriches theirs. But that kind of relationship requires something that many people find deeply threatening. It requires you to be a complete person on your own. And becoming a complete person on your own means confronting all the parts of yourself you've been outsourcing to relationships. The validation you get from being needed, the sense of purpose you get from fixing someone, the distraction that a chaotic relationship provides from the quieter, more difficult work of building your own life. Here's a thought worth sitting with. Sometimes a turbulent relationship is more comfortable than a stable one, not because you're irrational, but because turbulence is familiar, and because the constant activity of managing someone else's emotional world keeps you from having to face your own. Think about that for a moment when you're consumed by someone else's problems, when you're managing their moods, anticipating their reactions, walking on eggshells around their instability. You're occupied. You're busy. You're focused outward. And focusing outward means you don't have to look inward. You don't have to sit with your own fears, your own emptiness, your own questions about who you are and what you want and whether your life is going in the right direction. A chaotic relationship is, in this sense, a very effective avoidance strategy, and the tragedy is that it masquerades as love. It masquerades as passion. The intensity of the emotional experience, the highs and lows, the reconciliations after conflict, the feeling of being needed, all of this can feel like the most real thing you've ever experienced, when in fact it may be the most elaborate distraction you've ever constructed. Now, let's talk about something that is genuinely difficult to look at, and that is the role of resentment in these patterns. Resentment is one of the most psychologically corrosive emotions there is, and it's particularly insidious because it often hides behind the appearance of virtue. The person who gives too much and never asks for anything in return looks generous, looks selfless. But often underneath that generosity, there is an accumulation of unspoken needs, unacknowledged sacrifices, and unexpressed frustration. And that accumulation becomes resentment. Resentment doesn't announce itself. It doesn't arrive with a clear label. It seeps into the way you talk to someone, the way you interpret their behavior. The small withdrawals of warmth and presence that you may not even notice yourself making. It poisons the well of a relationship slowly, and often by the time it's visible, the damage is significant. And here's the part that requires real honesty. Most resentment in relationships is the product of agreements you never actually made, but acted as though you had. You gave without being asked. You sacrificed without communicating your needs. You tolerated behavior you should have named. And then you grew resentful when the other person didn't respond to the silent contract you had written in your own head. This is not entirely the other person's fault. They cannot respond to needs you haven't expressed. They cannot honor a contract they didn't know existed. And if you find yourself consistently in relationships where you feel unseen, undervalued, and taken for granted, one of the most important questions you can ask is not, why do people keep treating me this way? But rather, why do I keep not telling people what I need? That question points to something real, because for many people, expressing needs feels dangerous. It feels like weakness. It feels like an invitation to be rejected or ridiculed or dismissed. If you grew up in an environment where your needs were met with irritation, or neglect, or conditional responses, you learned that having needs was a liability. You learned to suppress them, to manage them privately, to pretend you didn't have them. And you brought that lesson into your adult relationships. The result is a person who appears low maintenance, but is actually deeply hungry for things they cannot bring themselves to ask for. And that hunger, unacknowledged and unexpressed, becomes the invisible driver of enormous amounts of relationship dysfunction. Being able to say what you need, to say it clearly, without apology, without excessive justification, is one of the most fundamental acts of self-respect there is. Not because your needs will always be met, they won't, but because the act of expressing them honestly is a declaration about your own value. It says, I'm someone whose needs matter. And it gives the other person the actual opportunity to respond to you as a real person rather than to the version of you that you perform. And this brings us to something that I think is genuinely underappreciated in conversations about relationships, which is the relationship between honesty and attraction. Not honesty as a moral virtue in the abstract sense, but honesty as a relational force. The degree to which you're honest about who you are, what you want, accept what you actually think, determines in a very real way the quality of people who remain in your life. When you're not honest, when you present a version of yourself designed to be acceptable, when you suppress your opinions to avoid conflict, when you pretend to be comfortable with things that actually bother you, when you perform enthusiasm for things that don't interest you, you are not attracting people who love you. You are attracting people who love the performance, and those people will consistently disappoint you because they are responding to something that isn't real. The relationship is built on a foundation of managed presentation rather than genuine encounter. And when the performance inevitably slips, when the real you begins to emerge, one of two things happens. Either the relationship collapses because the other person wasn't actually interested in who you are, or the relationship continues but becomes a source of constant low-level anxiety because you're always managing the gap between who you actually are and who you've allowed the other person to believe you are. There is a particular kind of loneliness that comes from being in a relationship where you're not truly known. It may be the most painful kind of loneliness there is because it has no obvious solution. You're not alone. You have someone, but you're invisible inside the relationship. And that invisibility is often something you created out of fear, out of the desire to be loved, out of the belief that the real you is somehow not enough. The real you is enough. But you will never actually know that until you allow the real you to be present in your relationships and discover that genuine connection is possible. That is a terrifying experiment to run because it carries the risk of real rejection. But the alternative is a life of relationships that are technically present but fundamentally hollow. Let's shift now to something more concrete, because I think it's important to move from understanding the pattern to understanding what actually changes it. And I want to be direct about this. What changes it is not finding the right person. What changes it is becoming a different person, not a better performance of a person, not a more strategic version of yourself designed to attract higher quality partners. A genuinely different person with a genuinely different relationship to your own worth, your own needs, your own honesty, and your own capacity to tolerate discomfort. That transformation doesn't happen through insight alone. Understanding why you do something is necessary but not sufficient. You can have perfect intellectual clarity about your patterns and still repeat them, because patterns live in the body, in the nervous system, in the automatic responses that fire before conscious thought has a chance to intervene. Changing them requires something more than understanding. It requires repeated, deliberate, uncomfortable action in the direction of the person you want to become. What does that look like practically? It looks like noticing when you feel that familiar pull towards someone who is emotionally unavailable. And instead of following it automatically, pausing, asking yourself what exactly is drawing you to this person. Is it genuine admiration and compatibility? Or is it the familiar texture of a dynamic you already know how to survive? Those are very different things, and learning to distinguish between them is one of the most important skills you can develop. It looks like practicing the expression of your actual needs in small, low-stakes situations before you try to do it in the most vulnerable relationships of your life. Saying what you actually think when someone asks your opinion, declining an invitation when you don't want to go without elaborate justification. Naming something that bothered you rather than letting it slide into the resentment pile. These small acts of honesty are not small at all. They are practice. They are the repetitions that build the muscle of self-expression. It looks like developing a much higher tolerance for being alone, not as a resignation to loneliness, but as a genuine capacity to be with yourself without distress. Because if you cannot be alone without anxiety, if solitude feels unbearable, if you need someone, anyone to fill the space, you will make poor choices about who you allow into your life. You will accept what's available rather than waiting for what's actually right. And the ability to wait, the ability to hold out for genuine compatibility rather than settling for the relief of company, requires that you can be alone without it feeling like a crisis. There's something important here about the difference between loneliness and solitude. Loneliness is the painful experience of being disconnected from others. Solitude is the deliberate experience of being with yourself. And the person who can move comfortably between genuine connection with others and genuine solitude with themselves is in a very different position than the person who is always running from one to the other. Always needing company to escape themselves, always needing distraction to avoid the discomfort of their own inner life. If you find solitude genuinely unbearable, that's worth examining. What is it that you're trying not to hear when everything goes quiet? What thoughts arise in the silence that you'd prefer to drown out? Those thoughts, those feelings, those unanswered questions that surface when there's no one and nothing to distract you, they are not your enemy. They are actually pointing toward the work that needs to be done. The anxiety, the emptiness, the sense of purposelessness that appears in quiet moments, these are not signs that something is wrong with you. They are signals from a part of yourself that is trying to tell you something important about how you're living and who you're becoming. And this connects to something that I think is at the root of many relationship problems that people don't initially frame as relationship problems. The question of meaning, of purpose, of whether your life as you are currently living it is actually yours. Many people enter relationships carrying a kind of inner vacancy, a sense that something is missing, that they are not quite themselves, that they are going through the motions of a life without fully inhabiting it. And they bring that vacancy into their relationships, and they look to those relationships to fill it. They look to the other person to provide the sense of aliveness, of purpose, of direction that they haven't been able to generate from within themselves. This is an enormous burden to place on another person. And it is also a setup for disappointment, because no other person can provide you with a sense of meaning. They can share in the meaning you've created. They can support and enrich it, but they cannot generate it for you. Meaning is something you build through engagement with the world, through the voluntary acceptance of responsibility, through the development of competence, through the pursuit of things that genuinely matter to you even when they're difficult. It is not something you find. It is something you construct through action, through commitment, through the willingness to carry weight. When you're living a life that is genuinely yours, when you have work that engages you, relationships that are honest, values that you actually live by rather than just endorse, you bring something real to your intimate relationships. You bring a person, not a vacancy looking to be filled, not a need looking to be met, a person with a life, with direction, with substance. And that changes everything about the dynamic. Because here's what happens when two people with genuinely developed inner lives come together. They don't need each other in the desperate sense. They choose each other. And that choice made freely, made from a position of wholeness rather than need, is the foundation of something that can actually last. It can weather conflict because neither person is so dependent on the relationship that they cannot afford to be honest within it. It can grow because both people are growing individually and bringing that growth back to the relationship. It can endure difficulty because both people have already demonstrated to themselves that they can endure difficulty alone. This is very different from the kind of relationship that forms between two people who are each running from themselves, who have found in each other a mutually comfortable distraction from the work of becoming who they need to become. That kind of relationship can feel intensely alive in the beginning, precisely because the intensity of the connection is partly generated by the intensity of the mutual need. But it tends to become suffocating or volatile or simply exhausting over time because the foundation was never solid. I want to address something directly that I think causes a great deal of unnecessary suffering. And that is the idea that attracting better people is primarily a matter of finding the right places to look, or presenting yourself more attractively, or learning better communication strategies, or any of the other tactical approaches that get suggested in conversations about relationships. These things are not without value, but they are surface level solutions to a deeper problem. The deeper problem is that you cannot sustainably attract people who are significantly more emotionally healthy than you are, not because you're not worthy of them, but because the relationship won't fit. It's like trying to force two puzzle pieces together that don't match. You can push as hard as you want, but the shapes don't align. A genuinely secure person, someone with real self-worth, real emotional honesty, real capacity for intimacy, will not remain in a relationship with someone who is deeply insecure, chronically dishonest with themselves, or emotionally unavailable, no matter how attractive that person is or how well they present themselves. The dynamic won't work. The secure person will eventually move toward what they need, which is genuine reciprocity. So the only sustainable path to attracting healthier people is to become a healthier person. Not to perform health, to actually develop it. And that is a longer, harder, more uncomfortable process than most people want to engage in. But it is the only process that actually works. What does becoming a healthier person look like in this context? It looks like developing a genuine relationship with truth. Not the truth as you wish it were, not the comfortable narrative that protects your self-image, but the actual truth about your patterns, your fears, your needs, your contributions to the dynamics that have caused you pain. This requires a kind of ruthless self-honesty that is genuinely difficult because self-deception is comfortable. It feels protective. It allows you to maintain the story where you are the innocent party and the other people are the problem. And while the other people may indeed have been problematic, the story where you have no responsibility is almost certainly incomplete. Ask yourself honestly, what did you overlook early in the relationship that you chose not to address? What red flags did you rationalize because the person was attractive or exciting or because you didn't want to be alone? What needs did you fail to express? What boundaries did you fail to maintain? What compromises did you make that slowly eroded your own sense of self? These are not comfortable questions, but they are the questions that lead somewhere useful. There's also the matter of what we might call the courage of standards. Having genuine standards in relationships, not as a performance of self-worth, but as an actual expression of it, requires a specific kind of courage. Because standards mean that you will sometimes say no. They mean that you will sometimes walk away from something that is comfortable but wrong. They mean that you will sometimes endure the discomfort of being alone rather than accepting a relationship that doesn't meet the basic criteria for your well-being, and that is genuinely difficult. Particularly if you have a history of relationships that have left you feeling unworthy, because the person who feels unworthy finds it very hard to maintain standards. Standards feel like arrogance when you don't actually believe you deserve better. They feel like self-deception. They feel like you're pretending to be something you're not. But here's what I want you to understand about standards. They are not a claim that you are superior to anyone. They are a claim that certain things are necessary for your well-being and that you take your own well-being seriously enough to insist on them. That's not arrogance, that's self-respect. And self-respect, real self-respect, is not something you feel before you act. It's something you develop by acting in accordance with your own values repeatedly, even when it's hard, even when it costs you something. Every time you tell the truth, when a lie would have been easier, you build self-respect. Every time you walk away from something harmful, even though part of you wants to stay, you build self-respect. Every time you express a need instead of swallowing it, every time you hold a boundary instead of abandoning it, every time you choose your long-term well-being over your short-term comfort, you're building the internal architecture that makes healthy relationships possible. Not by making yourself more attractive to others, by making yourself more real to yourself. And there's something that happens gradually as that architecture is built. The people who were once attracted to you, the ones who were drawn to your compliance, your neediness, your willingness to accept poor treatment, they begin to feel less comfortable around you because you're no longer the person they expected. You have changed the broadcast. And simultaneously, different people begin to notice you. People who are looking for what you now actually have to offer, which is genuine presence, genuine honesty, genuine self-possession. This is not magic. It is not law of attraction in any mystical sense. It is simply the natural consequence of becoming a person with genuine substance and genuine standards. The relational ecosystem around you shifts because you have shifted. But I want to end this part of the conversation with something important, because I've been talking about change as though it is straightforward, and it isn't. Change of this kind is genuinely difficult. It is not a linear process. You will understand the pattern and still repeat it. You will make progress and then regress. You will find yourself, despite everything you know, drawn to the familiar emotional texture of exactly the kind of relationship you were trying to leave behind. And in those moments, the temptation will be to conclude that you are hopeless, that you are too damaged, that the pattern is too deeply embedded to change. That conclusion is false. But it is also seductive because it lets you off the hook. If you're hopeless, you don't have to keep trying. If you're too damaged, the work is someone else's problem. If the pattern is unchangeable, you can stop fighting it and simply resign yourself to it. Don't accept that conclusion, not because change is easy or guaranteed, but because the alternative is a conscious choice to stop trying. And that is a choice you will live with in a very particular way, not with peace, with the low-level suffering of someone who knows they gave up on themselves. The process of change in this area is not about achieving perfection. It is not about becoming someone who never makes a poor relational choice, who never feels the pull of a familiar but unhealthy dynamic, who never struggles with loneliness or self-doubt or the fear of being alone. It is about becoming someone who is honest with themselves about what is happening, who can recognize the pattern even as they feel its pull, who can make a different choice even when the familiar choice feels more comfortable. That is not a dramatic transformation. It doesn't happen in a single moment of insight. It happens in thousands of small moments, most of them unglamorous, where you choose truth over comfort, honesty over performance, your long-term self over your short-term relief. And over time, those choices accumulate into something. They accumulate into a person with a genuine relationship to their own worth, a person who knows what they need and can ask for it, a person who can be alone without it feeling like a catastrophe. A person who brings something real to their relationships rather than a vacancy waiting to be filled. A person who is capable of genuine intimacy, not because they have found the perfect partner, but because they have done the work of becoming someone capable of genuine intimacy. That person attracts different people. Not because they have learned to perform differently, but because they actually are different, and the relationships they form are built on a different foundation. Not the desperate need for completion, but the genuine desire for connection. Not the compulsion to repeat a familiar pain, but the capacity to recognize and choose something genuinely better. Here's what I think is worth carrying with you as you reflect on all of this. The question of why you keep attracting the wrong people is ultimately a question about who you are when no one is watching. It's a question about the standards you actually hold rather than the ones you claim to hold. It's a question about the needs you actually have rather than the ones you're willing to admit to. It's a question about the fears that actually drive your choices rather than the reasons you give yourself for those choices. Those are not comfortable questions, but they are the questions that matter. Because the answers to those questions are the thing that actually determines the quality of your relationships, not luck, not timing, not the availability of good people in the world. The world is full of people who are capable of genuine connection. But genuine connection requires you to show up as someone capable of receiving it. And receiving it requires that you believe at some level that is deeper than words that you deserve it. That belief is not given to you. It is built. It is built through honesty, through the courage to express your needs, through the willingness to walk away from what harms you, through the development of a life that is genuinely yours, full of meaning and responsibility, and the kind of competence that comes from engaging seriously with the world. Through the practice of treating yourself with the same consideration you so readily extend to everyone else. The people you attract are not a verdict on your worth. They are a reflection of your current relationship with your own worth, and that relationship can change. It changes slowly, it changes with difficulty, it changes through action more than through understanding. But it changes. And when it does, you will notice something shift, not just in the people who enter your life, but in the way those relationships feel less turbulent, less exhausting, less like a problem to be managed and more like a genuine encounter between two real people. Less like a familiar pattern playing out again and more like something genuinely new. That is what's possible. Not a perfect relationship, not a life free from difficulty or disappointment or the ordinary suffering that comes with loving other people. But a life in which your relationships are built on something real, something honest, something that actually reflects who you are and what you value. A life in which the people around you know you, not the performance of you, but the actual you, and choose to be there anyway. That is worth working for. Not because it will make everything easy, but because it is one of the few things in a human life that genuinely matters.